used to be someone who searched for safety in others. Ever since I was a child, I lived under the weight of control, strict parents, demanding partners, friends who only seemed to need me when they felt more broken than I did. I don't blame them. I didn't even know what I needed myself. How could I expect anyone else to? The year I stood on the threshold of marriage, I panicked. People often talk about wedding jitters, but this was different. Where they felt joy and excitement, I felt suffocated. I didn't hate him, my fiancé. He was kind, gentle. Not once had he raised his voice like the men before him. But something inside me remained unsettled, like an old wound someone had brushed against too suddenly. I told him I needed to live alone for a while. Not to run away, but to find out who I really was. Beneath all the noise, I knew it sounded strange, maybe even selfish, but for the first time in my life, I felt that if I didn't take this step, I would lose myself forever. He was surprised, of course, but not angry. He simply asked, "Are you sure?" And I, trembling but certain, nodded yes. So I left the city and rented a small wooden cottage on the outskirts of town. It was nothing fancy, an old stove, a few worn-out pieces of furniture, a yard with wild, untrimmed grass, but the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a space that belonged to me. No expectations, no need to smile to keep the peace, no one to monitor my emotions. The first few nights, I was terrified. The silence was so deep it hurt my ears. I wasn't used to the quiet. I wasn't used to the sound of my own thoughts. More than once, I lay awake with tears on my pillow, sadness rising from somewhere I couldn't name. But I stayed. I started cooking, just for myself. Not to impress, not to feed someone else, just to nourish. The first cakes I baked were burnt, hard as stone, but I laughed. I experimented with chocolate molds, pouring and reshaping until they began to resemble something I could be proud of. No one was watching, and strangely, that made it easier to keep trying. For the first time in my life, I wasn't ashamed of being imperfect. The seasons changed slowly around me, but inside, it felt like they changed all at once. That little house, once so quiet it unnerved me, had become a place of ritual. Every morning, I opened the creaky kitchen window, letting in the crisp air and birdsong. I made tea in silence, often just sitting with the steam warming my hands, staring out at nothing. I wasn't in a rush to be better. I didn't even know what better meant anymore. I just knew I wanted to feel something that belonged to me. Some days were soft, gentle even, like walking through fog, half awake but not afraid. Other days, memories came crashing in like waves. I would be chopping vegetables or folding a blanket when suddenly, I'd hear his voice, not my fiancé's, but the one before him, the man who made me apologize for crying, who told me I was too sensitive, too emotional, too much. I'd hear him scoff, and my hands would tremble, the knife slipping, the blanket crumpling in my arms. I hated how deeply his words had rooted in me. I hated how much of myself I'd abandoned just to make someone else comfortable. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rumbled low in the distance, I found an old journal tucked in a drawer. Blank pages, untouched. I don't know what made me pick up a pen, but I started writing, messy, fragmented thoughts at first. I'm tired. I'm scared of being alone. I think I stopped dreaming years ago. But the more I wrote, the more something softened in me. It was as if the page was the only place that never asked me to explain myself. That became another ritual. I'd write every night before bed, pouring out whatever surfaced, joy, grief, anger, confusion, and slowly, I began to understand. It wasn't solitude that had hurt me in the past. It was the way I had been made to fear it. I was taught that being alone meant being unloved, unwanted, but now, in this silence, I was meeting myself for the first time, not the version I performed for others. but the quiet, strange, tender parts that I used to hide away. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. I used to avoid mirrors unless I had to put on makeup or fix my hair. But that night, I looked, really looked. My eyes were softer, my face fuller, not with weight, but with calm. My skin held no makeup, no performance, just me. I whispered out loud, "You're still here." It sounds silly now, but I cried, because for years, I didn't believe that girl had survived. Around that time, I injured my back while lifting a heavy pot from the garden. The pain was sharp and sudden, and for a few days, I could hardly move. At first, I panicked. There was no one around to help, no one to lean on. I lay on the couch, stiff and aching, and thought, this is what I feared most. But what surprised me was what came next. I didn't fall apart. I adjusted, I rested, I gave myself permission to do less. I ordered groceries online, heated soup instead of cooking elaborate meals. I listened to music that made me feel warm. And I slept, deeply. For the first time in weeks. That back injury, frustrating as it was, became a quiet teacher. It reminded me that self-care isn't always about scented candles and long baths. Sometimes, it's about honoring your limits, letting the world pause so your body can catch up. And during that stillness, something remarkable happened. I began to dream again. Small dreams, at first, like baking a cake from scratch, even if it flopped, or planting basil in a tin can on the windowsill. But eventually, I dared to imagine more, what it might feel like to write a book, or learn a new language, or simply feel joy without guilt. I hadn't told my fiancé much during those months. We messaged occasionally, short and polite. I didn't know how to explain what was happening to me. I didn't even know if I was becoming someone he'd still recognize. But strangely, I wasn't afraid of losing him anymore. I was more afraid of losing myself again. One night, after journaling, I walked outside barefoot. The grass was damp, cool against my skin. I looked up at the stars, something I hadn't done in years. And without meaning to, I whispered, "I'm not broken anymore." Spring arrived quietly that second year. Soft and shy, like a friend I hadn't seen in a while but still recognized. The trees surrounding the cottage bloomed in pale pinks and creamy whites. And the light lingered longer each day. I'd sit on the front steps with a mug of tea, watching the breeze play with the grass, and think, so this is peace. I no longer needed constant distractions. I didn't binge watch shows or scroll endlessly through my phone. I didn't need to fill every silence. Instead, I filled my days with rhythm, baking, journaling, walking, breathing. There was a calmness in the ordinary that I had never known before. I used to think healing would be this grand, dramatic moment, a breakthrough, a reckoning, but no, it was this, small, quiet consistencies, choosing softness over urgency, choosing to stay. And yet, change was coming again. I hadn't spoken to my fiancé, Daniel, for nearly 3 months. Not because I didn't care, but because I wasn't sure how to bridge the space between us. Who I had been when we got engaged wasn't the same woman staring into her teacup each morning. I didn't know what I'd find in him either. Would he still want me? This new version who took up more space, who questioned more, who no longer apologized for needing solitude. One morning, I found an envelope tucked into the mailbox, his handwriting. I stared at it for hours before opening it. Inside was a letter, folded in thirds, and a photo of the two of us. From when we first met. He looked younger, gentler, and I looked small. Smaller than I remembered. The letter was simple. I don't know where we go from here. I just know I still love you. Whoever you are now, even if you're different, maybe especially because you are. I'm here, I'm listening, no pressure, no timeline, just come back when you're ready. D. I cried, of course. not from sadness, but from something deeper, relief. For so long, love had come with conditions, with control, with fear disguised as care. But this was spacious, unclenched, love that waits without demand. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I sat with his words. I went for longer walks. I reread my journals. I cooked more mindfully. I asked myself what I truly wanted, not just from him, but from any relationship. I realized I wasn't afraid of intimacy anymore. I was afraid of disappearing inside it. You see, I used to think love meant merging, becoming one, losing edges, but now I know, real love allows you to remain whole, to stay distinct, to breathe your own air and still reach out with open arms. One afternoon, as I kneaded bread dough, I imagined us living together again, but differently this time. Not in the tight, anxious way I had known before, where I molded myself to please, but with two people choosing each other daily. Not out of obligation, but joy. Two people who could say no and still feel safe. Who could sit in silence and not fear the silence meant distance. That vision didn't scare me. It comforted me. I wrote him back. It wasn't a love letter. Not in the usual sense. It was honest, messy, a little nervous. I told him how much I had changed, how much I had learned. I told him about the nights I cried, about the day I looked in the mirror and saw someone I finally liked. I told him I wasn't sure what the future held, but I was open, truly open, for the first time in my life. His reply came within a week. No pressure, again, just warmth, curiosity, an invitation to talk. So we did. At first, just phone calls, short, careful, but little by little, the old rhythms returned, though softer now, slower. We didn't pretend nothing had changed. We let the changes guide us. There were awkward pauses and tender silences. And that was okay. We weren't trying to go back. We were building something new. He came to visit one weekend in early summer. I met him on the porch, barefoot and unsure, my hands nervously gripping the tea I'd made for us both. He looked at me like I was both familiar and brand new, and in a way, I was. We didn't rush. We talked, walked, cooked dinner together like we used to. But this time, I didn't hover. I didn't apologize for doing things my way. And he didn't try to fix me. Didn't make jokes to ease the tension. He just listened, held space. That night, sitting under the stars again, I rested my head on his shoulder and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Safe. But not small. Loved. But still me. We didn't move back in together right away. There was no dramatic reunion. No perfect kiss under the rain like in those old movies I used to watch when I was lonely. Instead, there were slow mornings where we called just to hear each other breathe. Afternoons when he'd send me photos of sunsets and meals he'd made by himself. We were learning how to love each other again, gently, patiently, without expectations. But most importantly, I was learning how to stay with myself. Even as the days became fuller and warmer, I held onto the quiet. I still baked on weekends. I still wrote in my journal, especially on the hard days. I still watched the clouds shift from my porch, reminding myself that stillness was a form of living too. Daniel and I began to visit each other more, but we also learned to say, I need space today, without guilt. And that, to me, was real intimacy, the freedom to be alone and still be loved. One evening, months later, I stood in my kitchen making chocolate molds again. This time, they came out smooth, clean, almost professional. I laughed to myself, not because they were perfect, but because I no longer needed them to be. I placed a few into a tin and wrapped it in a soft cloth. It was a small gift. For him, yes, but also for me. A symbol of how far we'd come, separately and together. I'm not the same woman I was when I arrived at this cottage. And I'm glad. I used to live in fear of being abandoned, of being too much, of not being enough. But now, I live with curiosity, with care, with deep, tender respect for my own soul. I don't have all the answers. Some days I still cry. Some days I still doubt. But now, I know how to sit with those feelings, how to breathe through them without running. And that has changed everything. If you're listening to this and you're in a place of uncertainty, maybe you're feeling lost, or like you don't recognize yourself anymore, I want to tell you something from the gentlest part of me. You are not broken. You are becoming. There is nothing wrong with needing time. Nothing selfish about stepping away to find your own voice again. The world often rushes us into love, into decisions, into roles we're not ready for. But your life is not a race. It's a garden. Let yourself grow slowly. If you're afraid of being alone, I understand. I was too. But now, I think of solitude as a kind of homecoming, a space where you get to ask yourself, what do I love, when no one's watching? And when you finally do choose someone to walk beside you, do it not because you're afraid of the silence, but because you've made peace with it. To those of you who've stayed until the end of this story, thank you. Truly, thank you for holding space for my voice, for my softness, for the pieces of me I once thought were too quiet to matter. I hope, in some small way, this story has reminded you that healing is possible. That love, real love, begins with the way we speak to ourselves. Wherever you are in your journey, I'm cheering for you. Please, be gentle with yourself. And if you can, step outside tonight. Look at the stars, and whisper, I'm still here, and I'm becoming. Good night.